Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Seinfeld Saturday, where I discuss and review individual Seinfeld episodes. Today I'll be talking about Season 2, Episode 3, titled The Busboy, which originally aired on June 26, 1991. I took 10 pages of notes. Let's go. So, the beginning of the episode shows Jerry, George, and Elaine. They're eating dinner at a restaurant that is not Monk's Cafe for a change. They're all eating pasta, and George is, of course, complaining, this time about ordering pesto. Jerry sees a guy at the restaurant wearing a baseball cap, kind of like one of these, and says that the dude is either going bald or getting a hair transplant, which Elaine agrees. As a bald dude, I take offense. Or at least I should, but I love Jerry. Jerry points out that Elaine is picking up a dude she met at the airport soon. I always remember this part because he says he's from Yakima, right? And she corrects him, saying it's actually Seattle. And Yakima is only like 3 hours from me. It's a small city, but I'm always surprised to see it being mentioned on a show like Seinfeld. This is already Elaine's third boyfriend so far. Thought that was worth mentioning. George says that Seattle is the pesto of cities, and that part always makes me laugh. So this episode was not a particular favorite among NBC executives because of the fact that Jerry's character plays such a small role. But these are probably the same execs that almost caused the show to not be picked up at all, so what the fuck do they know? As the three are talking about Elaine's new boyfriend coming to stay an entire week with her, a menu catches fire at a nearby table. George, of all people, actually runs over to the table and puts the fire out. I personally think that the George of the later episodes would not have done this. The manager comes out and asks what happened, and George explains that the busboy must have put the menu a little too close to the candle on the table. Elaine jokingly says that she's never eating there again as the manager apologizes. You see the busboy come out in the background, and he's being yelled at by the restaurant manager, and he actually gets fired on the spot. Elaine feels like her joke must not have landed with the manager, and George feels bad since he was the one that pointed out the mistake. The next day, Jerry and George talk about what to do about it since George is still really bothered. Jerry tries to calm him down about it and points out that busing jobs aren't hard to get, but you know George, once he starts worrying about something, he can't stop. Elaine does a little bit of detective work and tracks down the busboy's address for George. Jerry thinks that it's a really bad idea for him to show up at the guy's house. He says that George should at least not go alone, so he reluctantly brings Kramer with him. Shortly after they arrive at the busboy's apartment complex, and here's a fun fact. Later in Season 2, there's an episode called The Heart Attack, where Kramer has a friend named Tor Ekman, a holistic healer that lives in this same building. Interesting piece of Seinfeld lore. And it wasn't really supposed to be connecting anything together, but probably just reused stock footage to keep costs down. Still kind of cool. Before George knocks on the busboy's door, he asks Kramer to just not say anything, if he can help it, because, well, Kramer. Oh, and here's another fun fact. This was the first time you actually see Kramer outside of Jerry's apartment so far in this series. And when you think about it, up until this point, Kramer was still a pretty minor character. This is also the first time that George or Kramer is seen without Jerry. So the busboy comes to the door, George explains who he is, and the busboy, although agitated, lets them in to hear what George has to say. The busboy's name turns out to be Antonio. George nervously explains what happened at the restaurant that night and apologizes. And about Kramer going there with George, Michael Richards himself said that to him, the character of Kramer is very loyal. He will do anything for people around him. Unfortunately, he is, as we all know, very accident-prone, even though he means well. And about a minute or two after talking to Antonio, you learn that Kramer didn't close the apartment door and Paquita, Antonio's cat, has escaped. Paquita is not a commonly used Spanish word, but it is the name of a mixed drink. So Antonio is pretty pissed off, and I think that is completely understandable. He demands that George and Kramer help him look for Paquita, which, yeah, is fair. And as I mentioned, Kramer being a minor character at this point in the series, he was actually meant to kind of stay that way, just providing, a little comic relief. But it was due to the undeniable talent of Michael Richards that Kramer would take off and become just as important as Elaine, George, or even Jerry himself. Anyways, they don't find Paquita, but George gives Antonio one last apology, and he and Kramer leave for the night. George is even more upset now after making Antonio's problems even worse, and is afraid that maybe Antonio will even come after him. George has always been pretty neurotic, I think we'd all say. Elaine comes to Jerry's apartment to borrow his car so she can drive Ed from Seattle back to the airport the next morning, and not surprisingly, the week with him had not gone well. She tells Jerry that she actually hates Ed and can't wait to get rid of him. And why, Jerry asks? Well, she's not really sure. I think we can all relate to that. Ed is a nice guy, but she can't stand him nonetheless. Us humans are complicated creatures indeed. Elaine even bought a new alarm clock so that there's no possibility of Ed not making it to the airport in the morning. And the morning comes in the next scene where you see Elaine's apartment for the first time, by the way. And the first time you see Elaine without Jerry. She wakes up frantically because, of course, her alarm didn't go off and Ed's flight is in like 45 minutes. Ed says that there's no way they'll make it to the airport on time and he could just catch a different flight the next day. Well, Elaine is not having it. She quickly throws all of Ed's stuff in a suitcase. Ed can't even find his shoes, which Elaine says that shoes weren't invented until the 4th century anyways, and humans did just fine without them. While that is happening, George and Jerry are hanging out at Jerry's apartment where George claims that he knows where all the best public restrooms are anywhere in New York City. And Jason Alexander actually said himself that this scene is accurate because of all his years doing Broadway shows, he actually did learn this about the city. And then in walks Elaine, looking distraught, almost traumatized, messy hair, still wearing her nightgown from the night before, and she tells her story about rushing to the airport, almost doing the impossible of beating New York City traffic and coming close but not quite making it on time. Julia Louis-Dreyfus said that she wasn't happy with her performance here, but most people consider it a classic early Elaine scene. And in walks Kramer, excitingly announcing that Antonio, the busboy, is coming up also. George is terrified, thinking that he's there to settle the score, in his words. Kramer brings him in, and he walks slowly towards a terrified George. He tells him that the other night there was an explosion caused by a gas leak at the restaurant he used to work at, and had he not been fired that night, he would have been killed. In his words exactly, had I not been fired that night because of you and your thoughtless and stupid insensitive remarks, it would have been me. He hugs George and tells him that he actually somehow saved his life, and all in the same night he found Paquita and a new and better job. Still smiling, he thanks everyone and leaves. But off-screen, as Antonio is walking down the hallway, you hear him bump into Ed, who makes a smart-ass remark and gets beat up by Antonio. This was an exciting moment for Larry David because it would actually be the first time in a Seinfeld episode where two unrelated storylines would connect, something that would become much more common. The episode ends in typical Seinfeld fashion where things end badly where it appeared to be on a high note. Antonio and Ed were both hurt in the fight. Antonio loses his brand new job because of it, and Ed had to stay with Elaine until he recovers. And George has to take care of Paquita, he says, as he, Elaine, and Jerry are at Monk's Cafe. The episode ends with Elaine and George being miserable, and Jerry just being Jerry, avoiding the chaos of his friends as usual. As I've already said a million times, I like every Seinfeld episode. This wasn't exactly one of my favorites, even for season 2. That said, it still has plenty of funny parts and is full of Seinfeld history. I just don't think it's quite on par with the previous few episodes. I'm going to give The Busboy a 7 out of 10. Not a terrible score, although 7 will be the lowest score that I'll give any Seinfeld episode. So let me know what you think. Is this a favorite of yours? Do you think it's pretty average? I'd love to know. Cheers, guys.